Is it? Oh. Sorry, I don't know why the slide is not. Oh, let me try slideshow. Okay, yes. So we start with a little nice curiosity. Probably, if we think about infancy and Rome, the first story that comes to mind is the well-known myth of Romulus and Remus. And probably until last century, that was the main source of information about this topic. But since then, there has been an incredible wealth of research, excavation, and so on. So now the situation is much more different. This is also a little curiosity. Is the first publication of Giacomo Boni of his excavation and the Foro Romanum, and quite significantly call it the Bimbi Romulei, because it was one of the first discovery relating to that period. But let's come to the talk of today. First of all, I'm going to very briefly introduce which are our sources for this topic. Then I'm going to provide a very brief review of the historical background, so the region of Latium Vesus during the Iron Age. And then I have organized the talk in different themes and how they can potentially be related to areas in political activity. Now, I'm not claiming that I can say how archaeology or our research can affect political action, but I'm hoping that we can start going in that direction, as also many of the funders ask us to do. So the available sources. First of all, as I mentioned, there is archaeology. I briefly introduced the fact that there has been many excavation in Rome and the Latin region. I obviously cannot go through into this. Then there is the literary sources, which sometimes we very well know are problematic. First of all, because they are much later than the archaeological events we are talking about. And also, most of the time, they are biased toward a particular point of view, mainly the male aristocratic point of view. Then we have physical anthropology, which also is not completely neutral. We cannot trust the sciences by default. Also, there might be biases and an interpretation problem also dealing with scientific matter. One and for all, for example, everybody knows is the great problem of sex in subaltern burials, which is a great problem. Then we also have cultural anthropology or ethnography. And here as well, the relationship between archaeology and anthropology has been often debated, and some people believe we can use it to an archaeological comparison. Some other thinks that this is not possible. And finally, in recent years, there is also a growing interest in psychology and how this can be interrelated with archaeology. And we're going to see briefly something about this as well. So first of all, as I said, a brief overview on Central Italy. By the end of the final Bronze Age, that is around the 10th century BC, in the Italian peninsula, there is the creation of many regional culture, among which probably the Etruscan is the most famous, but there are other like the Latins, which is the region around Rome, or the Sabis, the Picentans, the Ligurians. We are going to focus mainly on the Latins and a little bit of the Etruscan and other central Italian population. So focusing specifically on Latium Vetus. We can summarize what happened in this time of centralization and the hierarchization, the creation of the first city, looking at settlement and Burial evidence. So the first big change is during the final Bronze Age, when we move from an organization of dispersed village of the final Bronze Age to the big proto-urban center of the early Iron Age. You see them in the square on the right slide. Most scholars believe that this phenomenon is more revolutionary and on a larger scale in Etruria, while is partially less on a smaller scale. So the primary settlements are not so big in Latium Vetus, and also is a more gradual phenomenon, in the sense that sometimes settlements are already present in the previous period on the Acropolis, and then during the Iron Age, the settlement enlarge on the plateau, on the big plateau that will be later occupied by the city of the Archaic period. If we look at the burial evidence, I often define this period as characterized by some emerging burials. So already at this time, we start to have some exceptional burials, mainly male burials, that already present a complete suit of armor, even if in a miniaturized form, and also some sign of power, like the sword, which is the symbol of political power, or the knife, symbol, according to Beatrice's theory, of the religious power, and also some interesting objects. I cannot point it out, but the little ellipsoidal object that you see on top of the label is a sort of a miniature incense burner, to which we will go back also in the later slides. And it's quite interesting because it's a sort of precursor on an object that we will find in the 8th century BC. When we get into the beginning of the early Iron Age, we have a different situation. At this time, which, as I said earlier on regarding the settlement, is the time of the formation of the big proto-urban settlements, the symbols of power are kind of shared among different individuals. So they're not in the same, we don't find all the symbol of power in the same tomb, but in different tombs. Like if kind of the community of this emerging urban center wanted to mask the differences and emphasize an egalitarian ideology. Then when we come toward the middle of the early Iron Age, in the 8th century BC, we start to have the first sign of the creation of a proper urban center with well, I call this sort of the definition of the urban center. We start to have the first fortifications, and yes, I'm not going into this because this is another topic of my research, but also terrestrial transportation start to become rather important for these centers. This time, again, in the burial evidence, we have the first warrior burials, so kind of really exceptional burials that emerge from all other burials. And I hope you can see, if you remember those emerging burials we had seen of the final Bronze Age, we have kind of the same grave goods for the male warriors. So the defensive and offensive weapons and the incense burner that you see there near the little table. Again, we also have some very rich female burials. that present many ornaments and a great number of textile implements, and sometimes bronze objects like this toiletry box. But it's only with the beginning of the Orientalizing period that we have the proper explosion of the princely bulla, the well-known phenomenon of the princely bulla, with thousands of hundreds of objects, vases in precious materials, silver, gold, ivory. And at this time, what we see in the settlement is the proper urban realization. So, for example, on the Civita di Tarquinia, we have this important ritual focus where Professor Ponghi-Jovino has identified a ritual activity, including probably human sacrifice in the area of a ritual pit. And then later, in the 7th century BC, this area is again monumentalized with probably a regal residency. And at the entrance of this regal residency, the symbols of regal power, such as the axe, the shield, and the litus, were buried ritually. And again, it is well known that also in Rome, the last few decades excavations have identified probably the wall around the Palatine, identified with the Romulan War, and important houses and residences identified with the House of the Kings. And so what happens in the 5th century BC that was earlier believed kind of the proper moment of urbanization is actually only an urban consolidation in which we have a monumentalization of elements that were already present before, even if in a different, more perishable form, in arts form. Again, it's interesting to note that, again, at this moment of sort of urban consolidation in the funerary evidence, we find again a moment of egalitarian ideology with the disappearance of grey goods from most of the tombs, but also interesting the creation of chamber tombs to emphasize the role of the family and the gens. So, but after this brief overview, let's move to the proper childhood infancy theme. So first of all, personhood and rites of passages. Again, most of the time in the past, it was emphasized how there was an important passage between childhood and adulthood around 10, 12 years of age. And in particular here I present some status of girls offering their toys because they are abandoning their childhood from the sanctuary of Lavigno. And also in the anthropological literature, this is the threshold that has been generally mostly referred to. If we look at the archaeological evidence and also at some of the literary evidence, we start seeing that probably there was another important threshold also at the passage between infancy and childhood, which is probably around 3 years of age. And in particular, for example, there is some sources like Dioniso de Ricarnasso that tells us that Romulus forbid his people to kill the child below 3 years of age if they were unwell or or as well. And also that Plutarch remind us that Numa himself regulate the morning, saying that no child under 3 years of age should be born longer than 10 months of the period of his life. And also in the Christian tradition, we know from Gregory of Nazianzus that 3 years of age was normally the time of baptism. Then we also see that this threshold is emphasized also in other ritual and sacred activities. For example, at the festival of the Antesterie in Attica, the festival for Dionyso, the children about 3 years of age were given these little cups, so-called cups, and they had to compete among themselves who kind of was able to drink his cup more quickly. So we see again that this age seems to be an important threshold. That is also interesting that some of the literary sources refer to orators that are not really eloquent as infants, so as those who cannot really speak well. So again, we see an interesting distinction between infants and later childhood, even if in a metaphorical way. And finally, there is also, in particular in the archaeology of Latium Vetus, the particular costume of burying children below 3 years of age among the houses. So not in formal funerary areas, but just between the habitation. And this is generally referred to as the phenomenon of subgrundaria. This is an example of one of these tombs from the Forum Romano, also a quite wealthy burial. And then this is actually a different element. So normally children below 3 years of age are buried within the city wall, but in Rome we have also a couple of adolescents buried on the Capitol Inn, and this is still partially most historians and archaeologists, because it's supposed to be against the law that we find also in the 12th table, not to bury adults within the city wall. So yeah, these are some reference from the literary sources about the subgrundaria, and it's partially contradictory because the literary sources actually refer to only 4 days of life. So it's partially different from the archaeology. But we'll go back to this point probably at the end of the presentation, referring to other archaeological evidence. In the cultural anthropology, so in ethnographic population, we find a similar importance of this threshold. So, for example, between the group of the Bambaras, children after 2 or 3 years of age are included in some religious festival in order to prepare them for social life. Another important threshold mentioned in the Hausa population is in particularly the moment of cessation of breastfeeding, in which again the child moves from the care of his mom, of his parents, to join in a sort of small social group of older children in and around the village. And also, if we think about education in most of our in European Western country, 3 years of age is also the time where children start nursery sort of school education. But there is also a number of references and sources about ritual and also in the anthropology that refers to children after 3 years of age, so between 4, 5, 6, as having a different status. So, for example, this is we have from a small reference in the Etrusca Disciplina that at this age, some members of the aristocratic families were involved in the art of divination. Again, in the Greek world, we find the little bears, girls that were devoted to Artemis Breronia. There was a sanctuary both in Athens and outside Athens, and in the spring, the girls were processing to the rural sanctuary, and they were involved in various ritual and Celtic activities. In particular, they were wearing golden clothes, yellow robes, they had necklace, they had basket, and they were, as I said, they were called the little bears. And similarly to what we have seen also in the sanctuary of Lavinium, here as well, we find the deposition of status with the childish object to signalize how the girl were passing from childhood to adulthood, preparing for marriage. And finally, also in the case of the famous Vestal in Rome, they start their initiation between 6 and 8 years of age. Another few examples from the anthropological world. It's interesting to say how in this population, sort of children around 4 start developing more smarter skill, like a particular handling skill, like making small toys or creating airplanes. And also that by 7 years of age, they start acquiring a moral judgment, so to understand what is good and bad, and also understand sexual differences. So, as we have seen from cultural anthropology, children above 4 or 5 years of age have a completely different status. For example, in another population, they are allowed to eat with their fathers, while before they were only allowed to eat with their mothers and younger siblings. And again, also in the psychological field, I was discussing with some colleagues. I learned this from some colleagues in Cambridge. Apparently, around 5 or 6 years of age is when children start to kind of learn the ability of guessing what the other person is thinking. So sort of mind reading, which is apparently not developed before. So what is the impact on the policy area? Well, yes, we have kind of seen partially already. There is partially a quite interesting correspondence between sort of archaeological, anthropological threshold and educational and psychological threshold. Now, I don't want to bring this too far, but I kind of think it's starting interesting also looking things in this direction. And also think, as usual, the general problem, what is cultural specificity, which are the universal features, what can we learn? Then we move to the other theme, which is infant childhood perception. We have partially already seen these references, and there was a famous article of a few decades ago, especially from the last century, in which scholars believe that the Roma didn't care for the children, especially for those rules that I mentioned before, that they forbade to kill children below 3 years of age, and they also had to kill infants if they were not safe. So building mainly on these literary sources, scholars from last century raised the point that because in ancient time infant mortality was normally very high, higher than 50%, so basically parents would have not been attached to their children, and they were sort of creating a detachment and not caring for their, for example, for their burial. But there is actually a wealth of archaeological evidence that tells us the opposite, and this has been emphasized especially in the last few decades. So, for example, we have the Mother Goddess, which clearly points to the importance of rearing a child. In particular, there is a colleague of us, Giulia Pedrucci, who has studied deeply this aspect and has also shown how motherhood probably was also more of a shared activity in which both parents, but also aunts, an uncle, and the whole family was involved. Then we have also objects from the sanctuaries, mainly anatomical elements related to female reproduction and female activity, which again tells us how much actually society was caring for this important time of life, and also sometimes difficult to achieve. And also, again, there is also many breastfeeding mothers, or this on the left you have even a horse beat with the representation of a nursing mother, or infant and children representation again in the sanctuary, which testifies to the care of parents and societies for the first few years of livelihood that were also the most dangerous. Probably many of you will know also this this fragment of Bucchero from Poggiocola, which represents the earliest representation of childbirth known in Italy. Yes, and unfortunately, another line of research, this is mainly by, I can't remember her name now, is the archaeologist. But then the interesting point is that she has identified among the rubbish pit of the aristocratic house of Poggiocola many actually human bones. And it might be that this might be a way of disposing of death in childbirth or unwanted birth. And these are actually probably, if we think about the first reference we had about Sugrundaria, maybe it could refer to this rather than to the the position of children below 3 years of age. But I'll move on from this. Again, here again, we can see sometimes contrasting and very complex relationship between social recognition, private love and comfort, or also tough behavior in difficult circumstances. Again, I cannot put this slide to see how there is a very complex interplay between ideology, emotional practice, and normalized cultural practice. I think this maybe, no, there's 2 more themes. Please let me know if I'm being too long, or I'll try to go a bit quicker. This part is mainly based on the study of burial in Latium Vetus, and I analyze the relationship between objects and ages, mainly referring to the classes established in the well-known book of Ostia dell'Osa of Betty Sestieri. And mostly we are trying to identify at what age we start find the first evidence of maleness, which normally is the weapon and the fibula, the dragofibula, or femaleness, which is the textile tools and the arch fibula. This was a slide about demography to show how normally the in Latin communities, generally infant burial are underrepresented, but they tend to have a larger representation toward the end of the Iron Age. Yeah, so having a little overlook at the old burials in Latium Vetus, we can observe that generally in the late final Bronze Age, if you remember when we had the emerging burials, infant children are mostly absent, and there is only a few restricted to the area member of society. With the earlier on age, we start to have partially more children represented, but there is a difference. Mostly children below 3 years of age don't have the sex and gender, the gender indicators, so the textile tools or the weapon and fibula, but they start to have them more often after, they are sometimes more often after 5 years of age. There is a difference with the 8th century before Christ, when we find more infant burial with these indicators, but generally only in the higher classes. And normally the most common pottery type in children infant burial are kind of cups or bowls or jug and amphorae. I call the sort of tea set of probably these children. And also in toward the end of the period, in the 7th and 6th century BC, also the aribalos, the small parfum container that you see in the slide, was very common, probably also related to a way of treating the body with parfum, the infant body with parfum and emollient. This is a couple of graphs which summarize what I have just said with words. So you see on the left the infant, and on the right the children. As you can see, children have more often, for example, the fibula serpeggiante. It's quite common in both classes to have pendant and bracelet. These were the male burial, while and this is the pottery. As I mentioned, you can see a lot of little cups, bowls, and amphoras in the whole periods. And when we move to the female again, there is a great presence of ornaments in both classes, both infant and children. But textile tool, spindle and so on tend to be more present in the children burials. And again, for pottery, we have a similar pattern as we had for the male. There is no difference between male and female. So again, to conclude from this theme, generally, infant and children are underrepresented in Iron Age burials in Central Italy, and sometimes children have indicator of gender roles. And infants generally have no indicators of rural status, but with the advent of urbanization, there is some changes. And some wealthier children and infants tend to have more indicator of gender. And also another phenomenon that we see is that not only in Lazio Veneto, but more evidently in Veio, Ponte Cagnano and Pitecusa, so the more the center in Italy that had the connection with Greek colonies, we generally have equal representation of children and adults, so 50% of each. I was mentioning also how those thresholds are partially reflected in sort of apprenticeship role. This has been studied in particular by Lipkin and Margherita Gleba, and they have noticed that with textile tools, both in as we have seen in the funerary evidence and also in anthropological society, this the 3 or 4 year old is the age when children start to have some roles with their parents. And interestingly, there is another another scholar here at Bristol with a colleague from Southampton that are particularly studying the relationship between children development and the fact that they are and the fact that they are exposed to the activity of the parents. So basically, there is a great difference between hunter-gatherers and early urban societies, in which normally to be involved in the adult hunter-gatherers activity, you had to be 12 or older, while in urban society is much more possible for for toddlers, for children around 3 or 4 years of age, to be kind of involved in the adults' activities. And according to the scholar, this probably had a great impact on the whole cognitive development of our species. Finally, the last theme, how urban feeding, infant feeding can be related to urbanization. For this part of the talk, we need the help of obviously isotopes studies that allow us to establish the gestation, the age at weaning, and the gestation of breastfeeding in past population. In particular, I collected most of these study for the Mediterranean region from prehistory to the Middle Ages, and some, I hope, interesting trends emerge, according to which urban society tend to breastfeed less and when earlier. With urban society, I mean both early urban society such as Cataloghuc or Roman society, or the medieval communal cities. And so if women tend to wen earlier, that means that I can have more frequent birth. So an early there is some scholar who actually believe that an early cessation of breastfeeding might be connected with the, if it's not outweighed by mortality rates, with demographic growth characteristic of urban societies. If we think about urban environment, we would, and both infancy or maternal health and mortality, we would expect that in a more crowded urban environment, there would be an increased maternal mortality, but also probably thanks to the greater wealth and productivity, we might also have increased expectancy of life. And as I said, shorter breastfeeding times sometimes implies increased fertility. With a colleague from Germany, we have tried to test these hypotheses for a community in Latium and also Germany. I can provide the bibliography for all the methodology that were used, summarized in these slides. And in particular, I will illustrate the case of Osteria dell'Osa in Central Italy. This is one of the main important proto-urban center in Latium Vetus, and the Osteria dell'Osa includes about 600 burials going from the 10th to the 7th, 6th century before Christ. And what we have noticed happening in this community is that in the first graph, eye on the left, you see the age at death, which is has a peak around 3 years of age and then 4 or 5. Even if we have not conducted isotope studies on this community, it is probable that the high peak mortality or 2-3 years of age might indicate the time of weaning and the time of weaning, which is notoriously a critical moment in the life of a child. So we could assume probably in this case a sort of more prolonged breastfeeding time. As for the prediction, on the other hand, I cannot see my. The maternal mortality is increasing as normally for the prediction, and also expectancy of life and wealth of the population seems to grow and be correlated. What we have partially unexpected is the decrease in fertility, and I said the late cessation of breastfeeding. Unfortunately, because we don't have isotope studies, we cannot properly verify these trends. It's actually quite interesting that it might be because Osteria dell'Osa is finished in the 6th century BC. It might be that the peak, the shorter breastfeeding time and the higher fertility peaks again in the 5th century BC in correlation to other analysis that I have conducted also with the RAM size. As I said, some of the trends were expected, but the longer duration of breastfeeding and decreased fertility was slightly less expected. Again, why is this all important to us? Well, partially the the condition that we see in the past population actually mirror some of the current condition of less developed region. But also, it is true that sort of looking at long-term perspective in the past is like having a sort of social laboratory in which we can test different hypotheses on larger data set about which we know the sociological and political conditions. So we can test hypotheses in the past to help us decide for the future. And again, the demographic transition that I briefly mentioned in my last theme has been in particularly observed for the agricultural revolution, for the industrial revolution, and maybe if we learn more about the urban revolution that so far has not been investigated that much, maybe we will probably learn more about the next step, which for us we probably the time of the digital revolution. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I hope I haven't gone too much far. These are some of these ideas we have been developed in a conference I organized in Bristol a couple of years ago, and we are going to have another conference in Hamburg in July 2021, and these are some publications. I don't know what.
Thank you, Francesca. That was absolutely fantastic.
It's very difficult to talk to. It's a bit weird to talk.
I know. I find it really strange when you're just talking to a screen, and you didn't overrun it all. Don't worry, we are still within the time. But yeah, it is very strange when you're just talking to yourself and you can't see any faces of everyone. That was absolutely fantastic. I really loved it. I think it was really interesting to see how some of those patterns are to some extent still reflected in our own early years education. Like you said, the whole thing about usually starting nursery or kindergarten at the age of 3. Yeah, that was really fantastic. Does anyone have any questions? No one has posted anything in the chat so far, but oh yes, there's something coming now. We have one question here asking whether you could explain the Sugrundaria practice again.
Yes. Okay, sorry. Yes, I didn't explain that in detail. Basically, it is in Lazio, only in Latium Vetus, so not in other region of Italy. During the Iron Age, but in particular, kind of, let's say, start in some cases from the 9th century BC, but more cases in the 8th and 7th century, we find burials, inhumations, mainly inhumations of little children, always below 3 years of age. They're literally, or maybe I should go back to the picture, but literally the little tombs are in between the houses, so that's why they were called Sugrundaria, because there was below the what is called the below the roof. Sorry, yes, literally means burials below the roof. And there has been actually a few studies, because people couldn't understand why, especially Latium veteran, what do they mean? So some scholars actually even believe that it might be the beginning of, so according to Getty Sestieri and De Santis, is a way of aristocratic family of affirming the property of the land, so sort of property rights. but also some other scholars think that they might be more related to the cult of literal ancestors, and even it might be the origin of the devotion of the Lares and the Penates. And so that there was another interpretation more recently by Rosenberg, actually, who partially recognized how there is both a sort of individual, private reason for these burials, but also partially an intention for the whole community.
I think
it's actually quite interesting to see how, because the practice is also known in the Near East, in England, in the Middle Ages. So yeah.
So we have 2 more questions. I think we just have time to do them. So I'll just summarize them together. One question asks whether you can actually see differences between different cultural groups in Italy, and whether you can see patterns of one group essentially adopting a certain ritual from another group.
Yeah.
And the other question would be whether you can see a shift in weaning ages between urbanism and I assume the more sort of like pre-urban rural communities.
Yes, okay. Okay, the first one, there is clearly this is during the Iron Age the creation of regional entities. If one adopts, well, it cannot. There is sort of. But there is a sort of also a more northern. There is some people have called of about a central Italian canal. So sometimes there is similarity among regions that are close to each other, and sometimes similarities between regions spread apart. There is also a sort of jet lag, for example, in the moment of urbanization. So certain regions, for example, Latium, Campania, and Latium, Campania, Veneto, develop urbanization earlier, and some other more in a second, a bit later. So it's characteristic that kind of they have all their own single independent culture, but also they show a lot of, as I said, when there we go also in the connectivity. In particular, probably the one who has summarized it more nicely was Professor Niebuhr, who said that during the first millennium BC, the whole Italian peninsula is a sort of very well connected network in which all these cities flourished in collaboration among themselves. In the other aspect of specific similarity in ritual or non-ritual, again, it's a bit, I cannot do the whole course of the Italian proto-history, but in general, before the Iron Age, the southern region were mainly not only inhumation, and the northern region are mainly cremation. But then the inhumation seems to extend. In relation to specific children elements, in one of my papers, I tried to emphasize some similarities and some differences among certain culture, but I think that a complete comparison has not been completed yet. And the other one, in the change of winning, yes, that is a bit more difficult because it's kind of there has been 2 studies that have been looking at within in a long-term perspective. So there is one article that I study Europe and Asia in the last 10,000 years, and it sort had a chronological shift, so from more ancient to more recent. And while Mile partially talks about socio-political organization, putting together the prehistory and the modern, but to say between the big transition between hunter-gatherers and urban society, yes, that is well established. And I seem to remember that the hunter-gatherer was about 4 or 5, while with proper early urban society and later on it decreases. So I hope I've not confused more.
No, absolutely fantastic. Catherine, do you want to say a few closing words?
I'm now unmuted. Okay. Just to say thank you so much, Francesca. This was wonderful, and I'm really glad that you were able to join our webinar. And just for everyone that has stuck around, our next webinar will be February 2nd, and it will be by Giuseppina Marano with a paper entitled Another Face of God, the representation of the God altar in the Near Eastern Roman era between onomastics and archaeology. So I hope we'll see everyone joining us for that. And once again, thank you everyone for joining our webinar today.
Thank you, bye.